The small town of Pine Grove wasn't used to new faces, especially not in their police department. Everyone knew everyone here. That's just how things were. So when Officer Mike Reynolds showed up fresh from the police academy 6 months ago, people couldn't help but notice. He stuck out like a shiny new penny in a jar of worn-out coins. Mike was the kind of officer who ironed his uniform twice before each shift and polished his badge until he could see his reflection in it. His patrol car, always spotless. Even the other officers would joke about being able to eat off its hood. But beneath all that perfectionism was a young man desperate to prove himself. "You've got to learn to bend a little," Officer Tom, a 20-year veteran, would tell him during their coffee breaks at Linda's diner. "The law's important, but people are more important." Mike would just nod politely, secretly thinking that older officers had gone soft over the years. Every morning, Mike would arrive at the station exactly 30 minutes early, his notebook ready to write down every minor infraction he spotted during his shift. The other officers started calling him the professor behind his back, not because he was smart, but because he treated their police manual like it was his Bible. One particular Thursday morning, during the daily briefing, Chief Anderson had emphasized community policing. "Remember," he'd said, looking directly at Mike, "we're here to serve, not just enforce." Mike had written that down too, right next to his list of municipal codes, though he wasn't quite sure what to make of it. The locals started recognizing his patrol car and would straighten up as soon as they saw him coming. Parents would call their kids closer, teenagers would quickly put out their cigarettes, and even old Mr. Johnson would make sure his garbage bins were perfectly aligned with the curb. Mike took pride in this, seeing it as respect for the law, not realizing it was more fear than respect. His fellow officers tried to help him loosen up. They'd invite him to their weekend barbecues or Friday night poker games, but Mike always declined. "Got to review the new traffic regulations," he'd say, or "need to organize my citation book." They'd shake their heads as he walked away, knowing that sooner or later something would have to give. What made things more challenging was that Pine Grove wasn't exactly a crime hotspot. The biggest excitement usually came from Mrs. Peterson's cat getting stuck in a tree or the occasional parking dispute during the Sunday farmers market. But Mike approached each minor incident like he was handling a major case in a big city. He kept a detailed log of every warning he'd given out, from kids riding bikes without helmets to old ladies forgetting to use their turn signals. His supervisor once joked that Mike had probably written more warnings in 6 months than the entire department had in the past year. Little did Mike know, as he sat in his patrol car that sunny Sunday afternoon, carefully organizing his citation papers, that he was about to learn the biggest lesson of his career, one that no police academy could have prepared him for. And it would all start with a little girl on a bicycle, wobbling down Main Street's sidewalk. The sunlight caught his perfectly polished badge as he spotted the violation through his windshield. His hand instinctively reached for his citation book, the same way it had hundreds of times before. But this time would be different. This time would change everything. That peaceful Sunday afternoon was about to become anything but peaceful. Mike watched from his patrol car as a little girl, probably around 9 years old, wobbled down the sidewalk on her bicycle. Training wheels had just been removed. That much was obvious from how she swayed back and forth, her small hands gripping the handlebars tightly. Her father walked beside her, one hand hovering near her back, ready to catch her if she fell. "That's it, honey. You're doing great," the man called out encouragingly. Other people on the street smiled as they passed by, probably remembering their own first bike riding experiences. But Mike wasn't smiling. His eyes narrowed as he flipped through his mental rulebook. Town Ordinance 23.4. No bicycle riding on sidewalks within the business district. It was right there in black and white. He'd memorized every single ordinance during his first week on the job. "This isn't about being mean," Mike muttered to himself as he stepped out of his patrol car. "It's about teaching respect for the law." The sun was bright, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh-baked cookies from the nearby bakery. It was the kind of perfect day that usually put everyone in a good mood. Everyone except Officer Mike Reynolds. As he approached, the little girl noticed him and tried to stop her bike. Still unsteady, she almost fell, but her father caught her just in time. She wore a pink helmet decorated with butterfly stickers, and her shoelaces were double knotted, signs of careful parents who cared about safety. Afternoon, Mike said, pulling out his citation book. "Are you aware that riding bicycles on the sidewalk is prohibited in this area?" The girl's eyes widened, and her lower lip started to tremble. Her father stepped forward, confusion clear on his face. "Officer, she's just learning to ride," the father explained calmly. "We thought the sidewalk would be safer than the street while she's still getting her balance." He gestured to the busy road beside them, where cars were passing by steadily. Mike shook his head. "Rules are rules, sir. I'll need to write her a citation." He clicked his pen, ready to start writing. The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she looked up at her father, scared and confused. By now, people had started to notice what was happening. Mrs. Chen paused while sweeping the sidewalk in front of her restaurant. Old Mr. Wilson stopped arranging flowers outside his shop. Even the teenagers who usually hung out by the ice cream parlor stopped their chattering to watch. "Officer, surely there's room for some discretion here." The father tried again, his voice still steady, but with an edge of disbelief. "She's just a child learning to ride her bike." But Mike was already writing. "The law doesn't make exceptions for age," he replied, not looking up from his citation book. "How else will she learn to respect the rules?" The girl's bike wobbled again as she tried to keep her balance while standing still. A small group of onlookers had gathered now, most of them shaking their heads in disapproval. Someone in the back whispered, "Doesn't he have anything better to do?" Just then, a police radio crackled to life on Mike's shoulder. "All units be advised, Chief Anderson is en route to Main Street." Mike barely registered the message, focused on getting the citation details right. The father pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. "Officer, I really think you might want to reconsider this," he said quietly. There was something in his tone, not quite a threat, but a warning. But Mike was too focused on his task to notice the shifting atmosphere around him. He didn't see the knowing looks exchanged between the onlookers. He didn't notice the other patrol car that had just turned onto Main Street. And he certainly didn't realize that this moment would soon become the talk of the town, for all the wrong reasons. As he tore the citation from his book, ready to hand it over, Mike was about to learn that sometimes the hardest lessons come from the smallest situations. And this lesson was racing toward him faster than he could possibly imagine. The little girl's tears were falling freely now as Officer Mike held out the citation. Her pink helmet seemed too big for her head as she looked down at her butterfly-decorated bicycle, trying to hide her crying from the growing crowd of onlookers. "I need your daughter's full name for the citation," Mike said to the father, his pen hovering over the paper. The father took a deep breath, and a slight smile appeared on his face, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something Mike didn't. "Well, officer," the father said calmly, "her name is Amy Anderson. That's Amianderson. He spelled it out slowly, deliberately, watching Mike's face the entire time. Mike's hand froze mid-write. Anderson. The same last name as Chief Anderson. But it couldn't be, could it? He looked up at the little girl again, and suddenly the resemblance was clear. She had the chief's eyes, his nose, that same determined chin. The color drained from Mike's face as he realized what he'd done. Behind him, someone in the crowd whispered, "That's the chief's daughter." The whisper spread through the onlookers like wildfire, and phones came out, recording every moment of what was quickly becoming the most embarrassing situation of Mike's career. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching from her restaurant doorway, shook her head and muttered something about young officers these days as she disappeared inside. When she returned moments later, she was carrying a glass of water, though whether it was for the crying girl or the increasingly pale officer wasn't clear. Officer, the father, now clearly identified as the chief's husband, spoke again. Would you like to reconsider writing that citation? His voice remained surprisingly kind, despite the situation. He placed a comforting hand on his daughter's shoulder as she tried to steady her wobbling bike. Mike's mind raced. He'd spent 6 months building a reputation as the most by-the-book officer in the department. Every citation, every warning, every procedure had been followed to the letter. But now, standing there with an unfinished citation in his trembling hands, none of those achievements seemed to matter. The crowd had grown larger. Officer Tom, who had tried to warn Mike about being too rigid, pulled up in his patrol car and stepped out, shaking his head at the scene. Even old Mr. Wilson had abandoned his flower arrangement to watch what was happening. I've... Mike stammered, looking down at the citation, then at Amy, then at her father. The rulebook he'd memorized so carefully didn't have a chapter on what to do when you've just tried to ticket your boss's daughter. Amy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked up at Mike. I'm sorry, she said in a small voice. I just wanted to learn to ride without training wheels like the big kids. Her sincerity made the situation even more uncomfortable for Mike. The sound of another police car approaching caught everyone's attention. Mike knew without looking who it was. He'd recognized the sound of the chief's car anywhere. He'd polished it enough times during his probationary period. The crowd parted like a sea as Chief Anderson's car pulled up to the curb. Mike stood frozen, citation book in one hand, pen in the other, watching as his career seemingly crumbled before his eyes. The chief stepped out of her car, sunglasses hiding her expression. This was the moment Mike realized that sometimes being right according to the rulebook doesn't mean you're doing the right thing. As Chief Anderson walked toward them, Mike looked at the citation in his hand and finally understood what Officer Tom had been trying to tell him all those times at the diner. The next few minutes would either make or break his career, and for the first time since joining the force, Officer Mike Reynolds wasn't sure what the rulebook would say about that. Chief Anderson walked slowly toward the scene, each step echoing in Mike's ears like thunder. The crowd held its breath, phone still recording, waiting to see what would happen next. Mike felt as if time had slowed down, his hands still frozen with the half-written citation. Unlike what most people expected, the chief didn't look angry. Instead, she took off her sunglasses, hooked them onto her uniform shirt, and smiled warmly at her daughter. "How's the bike riding going, sweetheart?" she asked, completely ignoring the tense situation around them. "Mommy." Amy's voice cracked with relief as she carefully got off her bike. I was trying to practice, but..." Her eyes darted toward Mike, then back to her mother, fresh tears threatening to spill. The chief knelt down to her daughter's level, straightening the butterfly-decorated helmet. "I can see you've been working hard on your balance." She wiped away a tear from Amy's cheek with her thumb. The simple gesture of motherly love made Mike feel even worse about the situation. Standing back up, Chief Anderson finally turned to face Mike. The young officer felt like his feet had grown roots into the sidewalk. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The citation book in his hand suddenly felt as heavy as a brick. "Officer Reynolds," the chief said calmly, "walk with me for a moment." It wasn't a request. Mike glanced at the crowd, at Officer Tom, who was trying to disperse the onlookers, at the chief's husband, who was now helping Amy with her bike. Then he followed the chief a few steps away from the others. The gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh cookies from the bakery again, but this time it made Mike's stomach turn. He'd imagined many ways his career might end, but none of them involved ticketing his boss's daughter for learning to ride a bike. "Tell me, Mike," the chief began, using his first name for the first time ever, "what made you decide to write this citation?" Her tone wasn't angry or mocking. She seemed genuinely curious. Mike swallowed hard. Ma'am, the ordinance clearly states that bicycle riding on sidewalks in the business district is prohibited. I was just following the. His voice trailed off as he realized how hollow his words sounded. The chief nodded thoughtfully. You know, when I first started as an officer, I was a lot like you. She paused, watching her daughter wobble on her bike as her husband steadied her. I thought being a good police officer meant enforcing every rule, every time, no exceptions. A few feet away, Mrs. Chen had brought out cookies for Amy and some of the remaining onlookers. The smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies mixed with the tension in the air. But then something happened, the chief continued. Want to know what changed my mind? She didn't wait for Mike's response. I tried to ticket a grandfather teaching his granddaughter to ride a bike. Right here on the same sidewalk, actually. Mike's eyes widened. What happened? He asked, despite himself. My supervisor at the time taught me something I've never forgotten. He said, Alina, the law is meant to protect people, not punish them. Sometimes the best way to uphold the law is to understand why it exists in the first place. The chief gestured toward the street, where cars were passing by. That ordinance exists to protect pedestrians from reckless cyclists, not to prevent children from learning to ride in a safe space. Her words hit Mike like a splash of cold water. Looking back at Amy, who was now managing to ride a few feet without wobbling, Mike felt something shift inside him. The rulebook that had been his guide for the past 6 months suddenly seemed less like a sacred text and more like what it really was, a tool to help serve and protect the community. The chief put her hand on Mike's shoulder, turning him to face her directly. What she said next would change not just his day, but his entire approach to being a police officer. You know what makes a truly great police officer? Chief Anderson asked, her eyes fixed on Mike's. The young officer stood straight, expecting a lecture, but the chief's next words surprised him. It's not about how many citations you write, or how well you know the rulebook, she continued, her voice gentle but firm. It's about knowing when to use your heart alongside your badge. Just then, Amy let out a delighted squeal. Everyone turned to look as she managed to ride several feet on her own without wobbling. Her father clapped, and even some of the remaining onlookers cheered. The pure joy on her face made Mike's citation book feel even heavier in his hands. Look, Mommy, I did it, Amy called out, beaming with pride. The chief smiled broadly, then turned back to Mike with a knowing look. Tell me, Officer Reynolds, what do you see right now? She asked, gesturing toward her daughter. Mike watched as Amy carefully turned her bike around, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. I see. He started formally, then stopped himself. I see a little girl learning to ride her bike. I see her father making sure she's safe. I see I made a mistake. The chief nodded approvingly. Now you're starting to understand. Sometimes the most important part of our job isn't enforcement. It's encouragement. Mrs. Chen appeared again, this time with a fresh batch of cookies and small cups of milk. For the brave bicycle rider and our hard-working police officers, she said with a warm smile, even including Mike in the gesture. The kindness in her eyes made him feel even more ashamed of his earlier rigid behavior. Officer Tom, who had been keeping the remaining onlookers at a respectful distance, walked over. Chief, he said, remember when you caught me trying to ticket old Mr. Peterson for his Christmas decorations being up 2 days past the ordinance date? The chief laughed. Yes, and I made you help him take them down instead of writing a citation. She turned to Mike. That's what I mean about using your heart. The law is important, but how we enforce it matters just as much. Mike looked down at his citation book, then at Amy riding her bike, then back at the chief. Without saying a word, he tore up the citation he'd been writing. The sound of paper ripping seemed to release all the tension from the air. A small cheer went up from the onlookers. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly, offering Mike a cookie. Even Officer Tom gave him a thumbs up. "That's a start," the chief said, "but I think we can do better." She looked at Mike thoughtfully. "How would you like to turn this into something positive?" Mike stood straighter, eager to make things right. "Yes, ma'am. Anything." "Well," the chief began, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "we've been talking about starting a bicycle safety program for kids. Teaching them the right way to ride, when to use the sidewalk, when to use the street, proper signals." Mike's eyes lit up as he understood where she was going with this. For the first time since the whole incident began, he felt a spark of excitement. And who better to lead it than an officer who's learned firsthand about the importance of balancing rules with reason? The chief's words weren't just an offer. They were a chance at redemption. Amy rode past them again, this time with noticeably more confidence. She waved at Mike, all traces of tears gone from her face. Her father walked over to join them, carrying her pink helmet that she'd taken off. "What do you say, Officer Reynolds?" the chief asked, ready to teach bicycle safety with a bit more understanding and a lot more heart. Mike looked around at the scene, at Amy on her bike, at the supportive community members, at his fellow officers. In that moment, he realized that sometimes the biggest lessons come from our biggest mistakes. The answer he was about to give would not only change his approach to being a police officer, but would also make him one of the most beloved figures in the community. "Yes," Mike said, his voice stronger than before. "I'd love to help with the bicycle safety program." As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The chief's smile broadened, and Officer Tom patted him on the back. Amy, who had been listening while pretending not to, pedaled over excitedly. "Does this mean Officer Mike will teach me more about riding my bike?" she asked, looking up at her mother with hopeful eyes. "Well," the chief replied, glancing at Mike with a raised eyebrow, "that depends on whether Officer Reynolds is willing to be your first student instructor." Mike knelt down to Amy's level, just as he'd seen the chief do earlier. "I'd be honored," he said, "but only if you'll help me teach other kids what you've learned today." The way Amy's face lit up made him wonder why he'd ever thought giving her a ticket was the right thing to do. Mrs. Chen, who was still standing nearby with her tray of cookies, chuckled softly. "See, sometimes the best police work happens without writing any tickets at all." She offered the last cookie to Mike, who accepted it gratefully this time. The chief's husband joined the conversation. "You know, the community center has that empty lot behind it. It would be perfect for bicycle safety classes." His suggestion sparked immediate interest from the remaining onlookers. "I could help set up traffic cones," called out Mr. Wilson from his flower shop doorway. "Still have some from my old driving school days. And I could provide refreshments for the kids," Mrs. Chen added, her eyes twinkling. "Learning is always better with cookies." Officer Tom stepped forward. "Chief, if you approve, I'd be happy to help Mike set up the program. Maybe we could even get the local bike shop to sponsor some safety equipment." The scene had transformed completely. What had started as a tense confrontation was turning into an impromptu community planning session. The phones that had been recording earlier were now being used to take down contact information and share ideas. Amy, still on her bike, raised her hand shyly. "Can I make posters for the bike safety class? I'm really good at drawing butterflies." Her father laughed and ruffled her hair affectionately. Mike looked around at everyone. The chief, who had turned his mistake into an opportunity, Amy, who had already forgiven him, the community members eager to help, and his fellow officers showing their support. He pulled out his citation book one last time. But instead of writing a ticket, he flipped to a blank page and began jotting down ideas for the bicycle safety program. "We could teach hand signals," he said thoughtfully, "and maybe create a small course with stop signs and crosswalks. Don't forget the importance of knowing when to use the sidewalk and when to use the street," the chief added with a meaningful smile. Mike felt himself blush but nodded in agreement. Amy pedaled in a small circle around the group, each rotation steadier than the last. and we can teach everyone how to balance better," she called out. "That's the hardest part." The afternoon sun was starting to soften, casting a golden glow over Main Street. The smell of Mrs. Chen's cookies still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of Mr. Wilson's flowers. It was the kind of perfect moment that reminded everyone why they loved their small town. "Well, Officer Reynolds," the chief said, watching her daughter ride with growing confidence, "looks like you've got your work cut out for you. Think you're ready for a different kind of police work?" Mike looked down at his notebook, now filled with ideas and community offers of help, then at Amy's bright smile, and finally at his citation book. With a decisive motion, he tucked the citation book into his back pocket. It would still be there when he needed it, but now he understood it wasn't the only tool he had to serve his community. The answer he gave the chief would set the tone for the rest of his career, and more importantly, for the way the community would remember this day. "I'm ready," Mike replied to the chief, his voice filled with new purpose. "But first, there's something I need to do." He turned to Amy, who was still practicing her riding nearby. "Amy, could you come here for a moment?" Amy carefully steered her bike toward him, her control notably better than just an hour ago. She looked up at him with curious eyes, all traces of her earlier tears gone. "I owe you an apology," Mike said, getting down on one knee to meet her at eye level. "I was so busy following rules that I forgot the most important part of my job, helping people. Can you forgive me?" The little girl tilted her head, considering his words with the pure honesty that only children possess. "Only if you help me learn to ride better," she said, then added with a grin, "and maybe teach me those cool hand signals you were talking about." A ripple of gentle laughter spread through the small crowd. Even Officer Tom, who had seen just about everything in his 20 years on the force, had to wipe a smile from his face. The chief watched the exchange with approval, then cleared her throat. "Well, since we're all here, why don't we start planning this bicycle safety program properly?" She turned to the gathered community members. Would anyone like to share their ideas? Hands shot up immediately. Mrs. Chen stepped forward first. "The morning rush at my restaurant ends at 11. We could use my parking lot for practice sessions before the lunch crowd arrives. It's perfect, smooth pavement, and plenty of space." Mr. Wilson, still holding a bunch of flowers, spoke next. "I've got those old traffic cones in my storage room, and I could mark out proper stopping distances with my flower petals. Kids would love that." Officer Tom pulled out his own notebook. "The department has some spare reflective vests and storage. We could use those for the kids during training." As everyone contributed ideas, Mike noticed Amy had started riding in figure eights, practicing her control. Each loop looked smoother than the last. Her father stood nearby, but his hovering hands were no longer needed to catch her. "Look at that," the chief said softly to Mike, nodding toward her daughter. "That's what real police work looks like, helping people gain confidence and independence while keeping them safe." Mike watched as Amy executed a particularly smooth turn. "You know what?" he said, an idea forming. "We could create achievement levels for the program, like belt colors in karate, but with different colored bicycle bells or streamers." Amy's eyes lit up at this suggestion. "Could pink be the highest level?" she asked hopefully, pointing to her helmet. "Pink for the experts," Mike agreed, making a note in his book. "And maybe we could have a graduation ceremony where kids demonstrate their skills for their parents." The chief's husband, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "I work at the community center. We could host the ceremonies there, make it a real celebration." "With cookies," Mrs. Chen added, making everyone laugh. As the planning continued, Mike noticed something remarkable. The same people who had been recording his mistake on their phones earlier were now eagerly volunteering to help. The incident that could have ended his career was transforming into something that would bring the community together. Amy rode past again, this time attempting to signal a turn, just like she'd seen grown-ups do. Though wobbly, she managed to keep her balance while extending her arm. "Did you see that?" she called out proudly. I'm going to be the first one to get a pink bell. The chief put a hand on Mike's shoulder. Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our greatest opportunities, she said quietly. The question is, what do we do with those opportunities? Mike watched as Amy started teaching another young kid who had wandered over how to balance better on their bike. In that moment, he realized that today's embarrassing incident hadn't just taught him about being a better police officer. It had shown him how to be a better part of his community. The afternoon sun continued to cast its warm glow over Main Street as plans for the bicycle safety program took shape, turning what could have been a career-ending mistake into the beginning of something special. 2 weeks had passed since the incident on Main Street, and the transformation was remarkable. The empty lot behind the community center had been turned into a miniature safety town, complete with child-sized street signs, crosswalks painted with washable paint, and traffic cones decorated with colorful streamers. Mike stood in the middle of it all, watching as a group of kids practiced their hand signals. He traded his stern expression for a patient smile, and his citation book was nowhere in sight. Instead, he carried a clipboard with achievement stickers and safety tips. Remember, kids, he called out cheerfully, safety first, speed second. The children responded with enthusiastic nods as they navigated through the practice course. Among them was Amy, now one of the most confident riders in the group. Mrs. Chen had set up a refreshment station at the edge of the lot, where parents could watch their children while enjoying her famous cookies and lemonade. Who would have thought, she said to Officer Tom, that one almost ticket could turn into all of this? The bicycle safety program had become the talk of the town. Local businesses had pitched in. The hardware store donated paint for the road markings, the bike shop offered free safety inspections, and even the local printer had made special certificates for the graduates. Okay, everyone. Mike announced, time to practice our emergency stops. The kids lined up eagerly, each waiting for their turn to demonstrate the proper technique. Amy raised her hand high. Officer Mike, can I show the new kids how to do it? She asked. Mike nodded, remembering how just 2 weeks ago, she had been in tears because of his strict approach. Now she was helping teach others. The chief stopped by regularly to check on the program's progress. Today, she watched from the sidelines as Amy demonstrated a perfect emergency stop for the newer students. You've really found your calling, Officer Reynolds, she said as Mike walked over to join her. Thank you, Chief, he replied, watching as the kids practiced. Though I have to admit, I never thought my biggest mistake would lead to my proudest achievement. A small boy who had been struggling with balance finally managed to ride in a straight line. The whole group erupted in cheers, and Mike felt his heart swell with pride. This was what real community policing looked like. Next week is graduation day for our first group, Mike told the chief. We've got special pink bells for the advanced riders, just like we promised. He glanced at Amy, who had been practicing extra hard to earn hers. Parents had started spreading the word to neighboring towns, and there was already a waiting list for the next session. What had begun as a way to make up for a mistake had grown into something much bigger. Mr. Wilson arrived with fresh flowers to replace the ones marking the practice course. These kids ride better than half the adults in town now, he commented, watching the students navigate the course with growing confidence. Officer Tom, who had been helping with the advanced group, walked over with his own observation. You know what I haven't seen in the past 2 weeks? He asked with a knowing smile. Not a single bike-related complaint. Not one. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the practice course as the day's session wound down. Parents began gathering their children, each young rider proudly showing off their new skills. Mike helped the last student adjust their helmet before heading home. Looking around at the transformed lot, the carefully painted lines, the well-used practice course, the happy faces, he couldn't help but smile. A small hand tugged at his uniform sleeve. It was Amy, holding her bike with one hand. Officer Mike, she said seriously, Thank you for not giving me that ticket. This is much better." The chief, overhearing her daughter's words, gave Mike an approving nod. In that moment, he understood something profound about law enforcement. Sometimes the best way to serve and protect is to put down the citation book and pick up a helping hand instead. As the sun set on another successful day of the bicycle safety program, Mike realized that his almost career-ending mistake hadn't just changed him. It had changed the entire community, one bike rider at a time. 1 year had passed since that fateful day on Main Street, and Pine Grove had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The little bicycle safety program that started with one officer's mistake had grown into something extraordinary. On this bright morning, Mike stood in front of a room full of police officers from different towns. They had all come to learn about what the newspapers were calling the Pine Grove Method, a new approach to community policing that put helping before punishing. "It all started with a citation I almost wrote," Mike began, his voice carrying through the room. "I was so focused on following rules that I forgot about following my heart." The officers nodded, many of them having faced similar moments in their careers. Just then, a familiar figure zipped past the window on a bicycle. Amy, now an expert rider, was leading a group of younger children in a safety demonstration. Her pink bell jingled cheerfully as she showed them proper hand signals. "See that?" Mike pointed out to his fellow officers. "That's the little girl I almost ticketed. Now she helps teach our newest riders." Pride filled his voice as he watched her confidently guide the younger kids. The bicycle safety program had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. What started in a community center parking lot now included weekend family rides, maintenance workshops, and even a special program for elderly residents wanting to get back into cycling. Mrs. Chen's restaurant had become the unofficial headquarters for the program. She even added a bicycle special to her menu, a sandwich and cookie combo that came with a free safety tip printed on the wrapper. The best part, Mike told the visiting officers, is that we haven't just made safer riders. We've built stronger relationships. He shared stories about how former troublemakers had become volunteer instructors, how parents now waved at police cars instead of tensing up, and how the community had grown closer. Chief Anderson, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Officer Reynolds won't tell you this himself," she said with a smile, "but our community complaints are down 60% since the program started. And it's not because we're being lenient, it's because we're being understanding." Through the window, they could see Mr. Wilson setting up his traffic cones for the day's lessons. His flower shop now had a special display of bicycle-themed arrangements, and he'd become famous for giving free flowers to kids who demonstrated good riding habits. "The lesson I learned," Mike continued, "wasn't just about bicycle safety. It was about what happens when law enforcement becomes heart enforcement." A few officers chuckled at the play on words, but they all understood the deeper meaning. Outside, Amy had lined up her group of young riders for practice. Her father watched proudly from the sidelines, remembering how nervous she'd been a year ago. Now she was helping others overcome their own fears. The visiting officers took notes as Mike explained how to start similar programs in their own towns. "Remember," he said, "every citation not written is an opportunity to teach instead." As the presentation ended, Chief Anderson had one more surprise. "The governor's office called this morning," she announced. "They want to make our bicycle safety program a model for the whole state." Mike felt overwhelmed with emotion as he looked out at the scene. Amy teaching her young students, Mrs. Chen delivering snacks to the practice area, Officer Tom helping a wobbly new rider, and Mr. Wilson creating paths with his flower petals. The moment that could have ended his career had instead defined it. His citation book, now dusty from disuse, sat in his desk drawer as a reminder that sometimes the best police work doesn't involve writing tickets at all. As the visiting officers filed out to observe the day's lessons, Mike caught sight of himself in a window reflection. The stern rookie who had once memorized every rule was gone. In his place stood someone who had learned that true justice often comes wrapped in compassion, served with a side of Mrs. Chen's cookies, and accompanied by the cheerful ring of a pink bicycle bell.